We go to our next guest, Nick Spencer. Nick Spencer is at the forefront of sustainability, boldly championing climate resilience through a blend of risk and opportunity, thinking and cutting-edge research. His innovative mindset extends well beyond technical expertise. He brings 30 years industry and consulting experience to translate complex environmental and social challenges into pragmatic, actionable solutions for forward-thinking organizations. An award-winning thought leader, Nick is a regular contributor to The Actuary, the IFOA blog, as well as writing for Milliman. He is a former Institute and Faculty of Actuaries Council member, a past chair of his Sustainability Board, and he is member of both the Climate Change Inequality Working Party and the Biodiversity Working Party. Nick is an advocate for aligning the financial service industry with a broader social purpose. He looks to drive change today by readying clients for the challenges of tomorrow. The title of his presentation is The Rise and Fall, Climate Change and Inflation Modeling. Nick, go ahead.
Thanks, Ron, and welcome everybody. Very good to be here. I wonder about that sort of introduction. That was very kind, Ron, but I just think it's been around a long time, I think, is the short version of that. What I'm just going to try and do, though, is something that I'm very keen and passionate about, is to pick actually on sort of Sally Bridgen's theme, and always used to work with Sally back in the day, 20 odd years ago, but always learn something from Sally, and to think about things in a broader sense. So we're going to look at this and thinking about both that sort of what is the sort of chess club, where it's drama club, where are the things going to impact, and then look at that sort of actuarial, more chess club into how can we bring it together and model that into numbers. So what I'm going to talk about here is about the sort of rise and fall, but actually, are we thinking enough about climate change's impact on inflation? So we'll start that by thinking about, actually, it's a sort of complex world. So this is where we need the sort of drama club thinking into bringing that. And then how can we bring that into the more sort of chess club framework? So how can we use a causal modeling, do an introduction of that to show how we can apply and fit that together? Then actually look at how we've driven that at Milliman into an outcome into our sort of sustainability inflation model. And then finally look at sort of what does this mean for actuaries? So life's complex. You know, is it inflation? We've seen inflation since the pandemic, since the sort of Russia-Ukraine war, as sort of areas are going up. And I actually think this is a part of a deeper theme when we go around and think about the different areas of how does this interact with sustainability. Well, sustainability, certainly we may see sort of carbon pricing, certainly allowance for the sort of greenhouse gases, and or the need for offsets, the sequestration, the reserving them. As the climate becomes more severe, we may see more supply chain shifts and interruptions. We may need to produce things more locally. We may need to allow for disruptions in the supply chain. We're going to have to rethink our processes. We're going to need it's going to be changes in the demands in regards to commodities. And actually behind all this, and what we're already seeing and experiencing, is more geopolitical conflict. So this is a sort of backdrop of some of the things that we've been facing, we can see in the past few years. But actually that alone is not enough in terms of that. We can actually see if those are sort of trending conditions, we may get spikes. So we've seen sort of food inflation. Well, you know, climate change may lead to harvest failures. We'll see the physical damage, the storms that, you know, is it category 6? That's potentially in the process of striking Jamaica. Load sharing, I believe this is a sort of South African term, but we've seen the fragility of the power systems and how both sort of direct and indirect strains that are coming on it, as we're looking for more electricity, we're putting this under strain. Are we actually going to be able to generate all the electricity they need and all the way through the transition that we're anticipating? And finally, a rise of protectionism. I've actually been talking about this slide for over a year now, so before the Trump administration, but I think that's just one example of that, and it's actually a backdrop that we've again seen in different areas, in different places, in terms of that, and I think again reflecting a more sort of hostile environment, I think, for overall trade and trade policy between that. Now, it's not all bad news. In the long run, we can actually think and look to things such as AI, increased efficiencies. Once the renewable power is there and you've got the wind turbine or the solar panels, it's largely generating electricity for free. I mean, you've done the cost, you then get the benefit. And in the long run, it's lower cost. Again, renewables, 90% of renewables last year came in at lower cost than their fossil fuel equivalents. So in the long run, we can see actually an amelioration of inflation, but I think in the short run and the medium term, these other trends are likely to predominate. So, you know, to sort of rephrase that and then start to structure it, you know, what are these different types of drivers of climate inflation? Well, first of all, we have these sort of transition costs. We're going from where we are today to where we are tomorrow. And we're going to need to invest up front to do that, and therefore we're going to need to pay those back. The second part of this is about transition efficiencies. You know, those could come through in the long run, but that's in the long run. We need to sort of pay for that in the meantime. We're going to have physical factors that influence the climate and the such like. So, you know, whether the damages costs us money in the long run. So we're going to have to replace the insurance costs are going to go up. We're going to have more variability and therefore bill for just in case rather than just in time. And actually, I think it's part of a broader sense of less sort of certainty. We're going to have more demand over resources. We're going to have sort of people and migration displacement. Migration may rise to as much as 250 million people or more by 2050, according to some World Bank estimates. We're going to face increasing inequalities, and these again are liable to lead to geopolitical tensions. So I think geopolitical instability, weather instability, and unknown are also a feature of this world and environment. So if we take that backdrop, how can we take those amorphous clouds and those lightning strikes and turn them into a model of understanding? And indeed, this is not only a sort of something that we would like to do, this is something that we really have to do. So, you know, what makes the risk so difficult to assess? Well, the future is highly uncertain. There's multiple complex interactions. The outcomes are not linear, so it can have small impacts, can have large changes. And there's a sort of cross-cutting element of this that sort of accelerate risk. By using a causal model, we actually look to take a view of the whole system and understand this as an emergent property of this system. What we do is we look at how these drivers are interconnected and explore their sort of emergent properties, their non-linearity through scenarios and the dynamics of the tail distributions. So in comparison, rather than the traditional approach, which is to start with scenarios, select your scenarios, create a distribution, and then aggregate that to create your total losses, which is very much driven by historical data and subjective assumptions. We are actually looking at this on conditional narratives. What are the what ifs or what could be? We don't have to be tied in by historical data. And actually, as we use a sort of joint probability distribution, we are move away from those subjective sort of aggregation and correlation assumptions. And this itself is then much better suited for a complex risk system and something where the future is going to be different from the past. And clearly under climate change, those conditions as they evolve are going to be different in the future. So I've talked about a causal model, but what do I mean? It's sort of conditions on the states of the underlying drivers to the events that they can occur. And we can start by doing this qualitatively to build the system, and then sort of quantitatively to build that out. Well, how does that look like in practice? Sorry, are we back in business?
Yes.
So we're talking about the model. Hopefully people have had a chance to have a look at through. So you can see how we build up the map and the such like. In fact, when we sit down with a group of experts, typically about sort of 12 or so, and discuss all the ideas that they are talking about connecting. And actually what we get is something that looks like the map on the left, which you can see is a large cloud of different areas and different connections built from that expert. Now, I always get told off by colleagues if I say, well, we can apply the 80-20 rule, but we apply something that looks, to me, incredibly similar to the 80-20 rule, and find that with around 10 to 20% of the nodes, you can actually capture the vast majority of the system. So what we do, using a bit of maths in the background, is summarize this to, we say, the minimally complex model, but essentially an overview of where the key nodes are, what are the key parts of the story. So if you like, this is the plot summary of a movie, as opposed to every single scene, sequence, and cut that the director is in. But we can get to the plot summary because we're looking to build this into the narratives. Now, in that fashion, as they do on children's TVs, of here's one we prepared earlier, and in fact, there's more details there, but this is our inflation map of that. If we go back to the beginning, you'll see in the color boxes on the bottom, we've got those different areas of that. So we've got the sort of physical risk. We subdivide this into the global influences. So what is happening globally in things such as policy determination. We have the local, so cost of renewables is a key part of this, that part of that transition. Well, what is the domestic policy in creating that? And the final part is, how's the transition going? What is the state of the world in terms of how much the transition goes? The pace of that can help in the medium to long term in terms of that transition, but are you competing over the same commodities and goods? So that enables us to think through these different parts of the model and how these drivers are starting to build up into that. We then use that sort of bottom level of drivers to build in to say, well, where are the things where it bites in that sort of direct inflationary sources in terms of the things that are happening. So if we end up in that old classic economics of a mismatch of supply and demand, the price will go up. If we're looking for additional returns on the capital, then that itself will require prices to go up. If the level of productivity in the local economy, well, if the economy is overheating, we're actually putting a lot of investment in, prices go up. And then we've looked at the sort of the direct underlying elements of that cost of living, be it that from higher energy costs, higher food costs, higher sort of payments in regards to disruption to the system, are all fed into that cost of living area. How do we take that? Well, for each of those areas and underlying each of those nodes, those bubbles, in that we can actually sort of determine both at the bottom level, what is the state of the world? So the degrees of global transition to a global sustainable economy. Are we in low, medium, or high? How can we build this across the different areas? Each of those nodes, we can then say, how much do they relate to the other ones? What is their distribution? And essentially build this up through a sequence of binomial distributions up until we reach to the top node, where we can actually look at those aggregate influence and therefore start getting a map out of inflation. This then sort of is coming through and repeating the slide. So in the interest of time, I will move forward. How does this inform us? Well, again, if you look through the sort of a snapshot where you can see, I think we sort of blurred out the actual titles here, but this is a different map just looking at the underlying risk model through. We can start asking ourselves, well, if we start with particular states of the world, what is that outcome in regards to inflation? So if we decide we know what our state of transition is, we know the state of the global economy and what our domestic is, we can then say, well, what does that give us? We can then make changes, examine scenarios where those come through. But because this is just maths, we can run maths forwards or we could run maths backwards. So we can actually start at the top and then rewind this to then say, if inflation was likely to have a spike, say 5, 6, 7%, how has that impacted us? Where are those causes that have come from? What are the areas that we need to be alert for that have the highest sensitivity? Now, we did, in our paper that's written up in the actuary, we actually looked at different areas. One of the areas that we actually, unbeknownst to us, but we sort of emerged from the model, is actually one of the most significant areas of medium-term inflation. This was calibrated over the next 3 to 5 years, was a lack of global coordination. So when politicians and the system acted against each other, that actually itself was actually one of the biggest single drivers of inflation. But we said, well, what happens if we actually then look at some underlying small areas that could sort of have a similar impact and say governments act slightly more protectionist. We have slightly more severe weather events. So the sort of things that we may be seeing under trending, and the global businesses, don't rapidly move across to the transition, but slightly move there. And we actually say, well, those sort of 3 very small things have actually ended up very similar to that one big thing. What then happens is what happens next. And actually, in both of these next 2 parts, we actually say, well, we can get to a point of fragility with those stresses. When we add the next stress, we then get a step up. So if we move the transition subsidies altogether, then we actually move up to something that sort of steps up and has an even bigger impact than the original. Or alternatively, if we were then to truly magnify it, start again with those 3 parts under B, but then throw in a geopolitical conflict, and we go from 2.9% mean to a 4.2% mean. In other words, a massive step up of inflation. Now, this is not predicated on the basis of just looking back at, say, the sort of Russian-Ukraine conflict, although this is the exact pattern that did it obviously occur at that point in time. But actually, this was a reflection on the system coming into that and how that plays forward. What does this mean overall? We're just looking at the right-hand side. What we're essentially talking about today is a mean inflation that, this is based on the UK and sterling, so it was just slightly over 2%. But the ability to sort of spike up to 7% in a stress. Actually, we saw in most of these climate scenarios how that mean was starting to head towards 3%. With a possibility actually with that fragility of moving up to 4, so almost double the original mean. But also those spikes in inflations could reach levels of 11, 12, or even almost 15% on the side, the 1 in 20 being sort of what a sort of monthly type of inflation could reach in these sort of stress scenarios. So it shows that, under the inflation area, this actually could be significantly higher than that sort of 2% central bank regime that we've been comfortably seeing since the early 2000s. So what are the implications for actuaries? Well, the implications for actuaries is, first of all, I think this is going to be a necessary set of techniques to have a look at prospective risk, as opposed to just relying on sampling past distributions. And there's a need to really think about the sort of complexities of this world as we think about sort of authors and other areas. So include that in sustainability. The sustainability of the inflation regime. I think there's a sort of residual inflation risk that is actually going to be higher and longer. So should this be influencing best estimates? And inflation is just one part of this complexity. of sustainability and the broader sets of tools as we go through transition. We could look at the same of AI. We could look at the same of geopolitical conflicts. Where we can boil this down to is some of those similar themes, consistent themes of inflation and sort of volatility, I think are both going to come through within this. But it's actually thinking about how can we design short-term narratives to affect, both of where we may be going as a core, but also how we may be going in terms of the different types of risks that we may be facing going forward. So what we need to then do is have that more imagination of the different areas that can affect us, but then think, how do we find our sustainable path, our resilient path against that ever broadening waterfront of different stresses and areas. So to bring this together, climate and sustainability poses a complex problem. The macroeconomic impacts, I think, have often been ignored when we think about the modeling. And actually, we can use some of these causal modeling to embrace that complexity and illustrate some of those cumulative points and vulnerabilities. So my apologies for the disruption in the middle, but I hope and brought us not too far off time and back and sort of at least give you a sense of this overall work.
Thank you very much, Nick. There are some questions for you, of course. The first question is a question you have modeled, you're looking. It is, you are talking about globally, but if you are able to look more in detail to more the regional effects, you see a lot of deviations from, and should your conclusion for each region be a bit different as what you have presented now? Let's say Southeast Asia versus North America versus Latin America. Do you have some insight in that?
So let me start by just caveating that the sort of what we've shown so far has been calibrated for the UK. So it's designed on the sort of UK sort of history. And indeed, this has been a sort of research model. You can look at different ways of sort of then calibrating and sort of refining that. If we were to move into different countries, Eurozone being an obvious one, but sort of dollar or any of the Asian currencies, you'd want to sort of then map that to the sort of experience and some of the drivers within that country. So that's the first part that would change. And so, yes, this would be different for each currency. The second part of this would be to review and sort of reimagine how that system is connected together. Yeah, I suppose in a very granular sense, you would be looking at maybe the influences on different diets and different foods within that basis, and that may lead you to a different conclusion. Your starting point in terms of the type of fossil fuel mixes and energy mixes and where you are in that transition would also be different. So I think some of the core elements of the system and the nodes would stay the same, but you may look to bring in either different nodes or calibrate them differently. So in that sense, the core elements of that sort of broader risk mapping are likely to be similar, but you would then refine. And the second part of that is then the individual calibration according to the history and according to the outlook would be different.
Okay. I have another question. And I think given the time, that will be the last for you. But you started, and sustainability is a key in this presentation. But what exactly, how are you prefer to define sustainability? Because there are different interpretations possible, I think.
For sure. So on a highest level basis, there's a sort of UN definition that works along lines to sort of sustainable practice is what we can consume today that doesn't impact the ability of our future descendants to consume, so that we stay within a sustainable world, is actually using the resources that we have in a way that doesn't impinge on future generations. So that would be my core sort of technical definition. If I'm talking about the sort of transition broadly, I think it's about our relationships with the climate, the environment and nature, and with our society. So I would refer to the sort of donut economics element of staying within our planetary boundaries. So again, only using our resources, including the atmosphere and nature, in a way that we can sustain on a long-term basis. And on the inside of the donut, to actually supporting humanity and each other in a way that everyone can flourish.
Okay, quite clear. So you don't exclude future. No.
The other thing is like it's about the future, and then in terms of risk and actuarial term, it's about the trends we see on our journey there.
Yes, yes. Okay. Thank you very much. If you're interested more in this, I can simply advise you to read the article in the actuary, because that should be very interesting. I will take care that the link to that article will be also on the website of CERA. So, and I like, on behalf of the CERA Vision team, I'd like to thank you very much, Nick. And we faced also how to handle operational risk during an online congress. But okay, nevertheless, I liked your presentation very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your forbearance and having me here today. Thanks all.
Yes.
Bye-bye.